Okay, so this is the first video looking at market failure in depth. So we're going to look at public goods. And I'm just going to get into the presentation and we'll review these at the end. So a few key definitions for you here. Private good is a good that is, or a service that is excludable and rivalry or rivalrous. And that's going to make a lot more sense once we get into the details of what a public good is. So a public good, therefore, must be a good or a service that is non-excludable and non-rivalry. So you really need to know these two definitions, very, very key. So what does non-rivalry mean? Well, non-rivalry means more for one person does not mean less for another person, and that's a very unusual characteristic, and we don't see that very often. But we'll go through some examples of public goods in a second. And non-excludable is, as it sounds, it means no one can be excluded from using the good or the service. I mentioned good there, but in economics we often refer to things as goods when we mean services as well. So here we go, nice looking cake here. I think it's a patriotic cake for the Queen's birthday because it's kind of like the Union Jack flag, but it looks tasty. Now this is a private good because it is excludable and it's rivalry. So I like cake, I like eating, and if I take a big slice of that cake, it means less for everybody else that is left. So that's the quality of being rivalry or rivalrous. So it is what we call diminishable. If I take more for me means less for everybody else. That's the nature of cake. But it's also excludable. If I bake this cake, I don't need to give it to anybody, and I can decide who I give it to. And if I'm selling it, if somebody doesn't pay me, I'm not going to give it to them. So we can kind of keep control of it, and we can exclude people from having it if we don't want them to have it, for whatever reason that might be. Usually in economics, we're looking at have they paid, and we're excluding them if they haven't paid or they haven't contributed. Okay, however, a lighthouse is what we call a public good because it is non-rivalry and non-excludable. So the main service that a lighthouse gives is light, and it's giving it out to the sea out here so that people sailing at night don't crash into rocks and die, basically. But it is non-excludable because if you're giving out light and you spot a ship that hasn't contributed, they haven't paid the lighthouse master or mistress for the upkeep of the lighthouse, they can't just look at them and go, oh, okay, I'm going to shine some shadow or cast some shade onto them. I think casting shade onto someone's like a trendy phrase nowadays for insulting somebody, but there is no way physically that we can kind of block out the light without just turning out all of the light. So you can't just exclude one person from excluding the good without excluding everybody from consuming the good. It's also non-rivalry because if there's a ship over here and there's a ship over here, the ship over here isn't going to take all of the light and mean that there's less light left for the ship over here. It doesn't work in that way. It's not like cake. More for one person, more light for one person doesn't mean less for another. So this is why I'm just going to go back to the beginning. I've put this cartoon on the front page. I got this from Google when I typed in public goods, and it's not so easy to read, but it says, move away, I'm trying to get a tan, I'm not bothering you, you're using up all the sun. So it's talking about it being non-rival or non-rivalry there. The sun is something that you can't, it'd be very hard, you can't really use it up unless you stood right over somebody when they're sunbathing. You're not going to diminish their enjoyment that they're getting from the sun. Okay, so this was a really good little table that I got from Wikipedia actually about the different types of goods. So over in this corner we've got non-excludable, we've got non-rivalry, and we've got public goods over here, and a few different examples there. And then over in this corner we have the other extreme, excludable and rivalrous. So we've got private goods, but we have these two kind of in between where they have some characteristics of being a public good. So over here we have what we call common goods, which are non-excludable but rivalrous, and this gives rise to the tragedy of the commons actually, which is something that you can read about. It's a famous thing in economics that we sometimes look at, but it's not necessary to look at it just for the AS test. And we look at, you can look at club goods as well. These are things that are excludable, so they don't actually cause as many problems as kind of pure public goods are going to cause, because at least we can exclude people maybe that haven't paid for them, and they're non-rivalrous as well. So more for one doesn't mean less for another person. So they usually have a kind of like zero marginal cost. Those would be there. You don't need to know these terms, as I said before, but the term that we tend to use in economics for this is quasi-public goods. So quasi just meaning that it's got some of the characteristics of being a public good. If you've seen that Disney film, you might pronounce it quasi. I think that's how you pronounce it in America, but it's we typically in the UK pronounce it quasi. So you can play a little quiz now here, and it's called Public Good or Not, and you need to pause the video here and see if you think it's a public good, or it's not a public good, or it's quasi-public good, or a club good, or a common good, and then I will reveal the answers. So pause it now if you want to have a go, and here are the answers. Okay, so we've got a lot of them have some of the characteristics of being public goods, but only to some extent. At a certain point, a beach in a park can become a rivalry, and it can become overcrowded as well. So lovely as this is, very interesting theory, why is it relevant? Well, public goods are an example of market failure because it's really this characteristic of them being non-excludable that cause these problems. So people can consume them without contributing towards them. And these types of people that do that are called free riders. And who wouldn't do that, to be honest? If you know that you can consume it and you don't have to pay for it, logically, and this is kind of traditional economics, we assume that people don't really have these kind of feelings about, oh, that's not a very nice thing to do, and they're not altruistic. We assume that everyone's going to free ride. That would be the logical thing to do. So if it were left to the private sector to provide public goods, they'd not be provided, because what business in their right mind would provide a good which is costing you to provide, but that you're getting no income for because people are free riding? So this is what we call a missing market. It's going to lead to this missing market. It's just not going to be provided at all. And this is where the name comes in, public good, because the way that I'll just skip ahead of this one. The way that the government are going to intervene is that they are going to provide it. So that's why we call it a public good. A public good is not something that's just provided by the government, because there's lots of things that are provided by the government which we wouldn't call public goods. Wouldn't necessarily say education or the healthcare system as public good, because they are rivalry. There's only so many places in the education system. There's only so many hospital beds. But we call them public goods because it's typically the government that has to step in and provide it. So provide it would be an answer, but also the government could pay the private sector to provide it. So this is like the outsourcing and public-private partnerships as well that have been around for the last, say, 10 to 15 years, have become more extensive. So there's something that you need to know about as well, and it's how technological advances have been making some public goods less public goods, so turning them more from being public goods to quasi-public goods. And typically one of the really good examples of public goods is public broadcasting, so TV broadcasting. And it used to be quite easy to free ride, really, public broadcasting, because it was a analog signal that's sent out, and you just needed an aerial, and then you could consume it without contributing towards it. And this is why TV channels like ITV and Channel 4, they don't try and make their money from charging the viewer for the service. They make their money through selling advertising space, because it was hard to exclude people from consuming it, and so you get lots of free riders. But we know that what the BBC do is they charge a license fee, and then you have these TV license bans. I know this slide says technological advancements, and then this ban that I've managed to pick does not look very advanced at all. It looks pretty old, and I think they probably have newer systems. But this is what it maybe used to look like 15 years ago, and they would catch people who were watching TV and not paying their TV license, and I think it's quite serious. Well, not serious crime, but I think if you keep on not paying, I think you go to prison. So that's a way to try and make it excludable, by catching people who are consuming it without paying for it. But a better, more advanced, more up-to-date example are these cameras, which are found in London, and they catch people who have not paid the London congestion charge. And this is an example of how we've made something like roads, which may be quasi public goods, because definitely rivalry, because we get congestion, but they made them a lot more excludable. Like, you know, we've always had toll roads, and, you know, go back to the Romans and they had toll roads and things like that, but never something as kind of big as London or the size of the congestion charge zone. And it's only technological advances that have meant that we can make it excludable in a practical way, because obviously you could just put up big railings and not let any cars in, but that'd be kind of counterproductive for business. So I think we've done it all there. So pure public goods are non-rival, or non-rivalry and non-excludable, and this leads to market failure as well. That's the recognition of the significance of these characteristics, and we know the difference between public and private goods, and sometimes public goods can take on some of the characteristics of a private good, and that's when we call them quasi-public goods. And technological change can make things like television broadcasting excludable, and the free rider problem is when things are non-excludable, and then that leads to the market failure.